back to the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thanks for joining us today as we continue to explore all sorts of things that have to do with the Catholic faith. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Josh Sullivan. Josh,
hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan, welcome to you.
Hello.
So, guess what? Okay. I don't know if you guys saw a couple weeks ago now, the CBC and other news outlets in Canada reported on the results of the latest census from Statistics Canada. And the headline was that religious affiliation has decreased in Canada, right? So I'm just going to give you some numbers here, which is, this whole thing is really interesting. It has a lot of layers, right? And I'm excited to chat about it with you guys because so Stats Canada releases some data that the share of the country who identifies as Christian, okay, made up 53.3% of the population in 2021. Okay,
so over
that's
half
Christian, 53.3%. 2021. 10 years prior, it was 67.3. So of course,
70%.
You see where the headline. So 67.3 down to 53.3.
Yeah.
So we've lost what? 14 is my math. Okay, 14%.
Somewhere in there.
But if we go back to 2001, so 20 years ago, it was 77.1%. So we're looking at, in 20 years, a drop of 25, almost 24 and change, % of the Christian population in Canada. Okay? So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect that, of course, was spoken about in all these releases here is that more than a third of the country of Canada is reporting no religious affiliation, what Bishop Robert Barron would call
the nuns.
The nuns.
N-O-N. Yes. Not N-U-N.
Yeah, the third of the country's nuns, religious sisters. Yeah. No, the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right? So now that has doubled, because in 2001, it was only 16.5% of the country was non-religious, whereas in 2021, the number shot up to 34.6%.
Wow, eh?
Yes. So here we go, right? Here are the stats. So the number of Christians, right? And it was funny because even the Catholic News Agency, I love the Catholic News Agency for reporting because I find it balanced and fair and reputable. Yeah. Reported about this drop in the Catholic Canadian Catholic population. So here we are. We're getting the StatsCan info. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this, and let's try and break it up. So what Stats Canada saying is that there's a drop, right, in Christians. There's a rise, and now I just said I want to hear what you guys want to say, but I want to say first. Number one, it's not surprising to me, right? No. Like. Number one, for it to be a headline like, oh, look, religious affiliation is down. It's almost like, look what's happening. It doesn't surprise me for a number of reasons. Number one, that's reflected in our pews. Like most churches across Canada have seen a decline in the number of people, right? There are some churches that you see lots of, there's population. The population's there. But even probably in ratio to the amount of people in the city, even like every church should be full, So churches have seen a decline in attendance. Number two, I would say, like, the growing anti-religious sentiment sort of in Canada, doesn't really help the cause either. Right? And
like specific laws, specific rules, for instance, the abortion thing.
Right.
You have to sign, in order to get funding for students, you have to sign something that no Christian or no Catholic affiliated business would ever sign.
Should ever
sign would be maybe. But you know what I mean? Like to get that funding for students, you have to say that you're okay with abortion, or say that that type of mentality is specifically targeted against certain faiths, there's no reason to have that as a requirement for your summer student.
Yeah. Right.
That just does not make sense to me.
I know. And I know I mentioned those two things, but I forgot in my excitement to mention the actual Catholic numbers. Because I do have the Catholic numbers.
Okay, let's do the Catholic numbers.
So Catholics are still the largest Christian denomination in Canada. The words of Stats Canada. You know, I don't like referring to the Catholic Church as a denomination, but that's another episode. So the Catholics are the largest Christian group in Canada with 10.9 million people in Canada. Yeah. That's 29.9. So let's call it 30 if we're rounding up with the penny, like the penny. We're calling 30% in 2021. Okay, so that's the largest group. Let's look at the stats for the other churches in order. The United Church of Canada, 3.3%.
Yeah.
Like a significant gap between the Catholic Church and the United Church. The Anglican Church, 3.1%. Okay. Two other Christian denominations each had more than 1 million people in Canada. Orthodox Christians, 1.7%. Okay. Baptists, 1.2%. Pentecostals and other charismatics total 1.1%. So large gap there, right? So 30% Catholics. Yep. The next biggest Christian group is United at 3.3%.
Yeah.
Where are these Catholics? Like, where are the 10.9 million people who said on the census that they're Catholic? Where are they?
I think there's two things there. One is that they're paper Catholics. There are people that have been baptized, that have done their sacraments, and we've talked about this before. Can you really call yourself Catholic? If,
we did a whole episode on it. You can look back and watch that.
But one
episode.
of the other things that I think that it bears mentioning, like here just in North Bay, if we use the North Bay population where we filmed the podcast, we have 3-4 buildings, Catholic churches. Two of them are a parish. So we have 3 parish communities. And they each have their own services, let's say 3 services a Sunday, a weekend.
Right.
Just to kind of give an idea.
Sure.
A daily service every day.
Yeah.
Okay. If we were to translate those numbers to every other church group around North Bay area, I don't think that any of them could facilitate or hold 3 different church buildings. Like they all have their own little, and they have their own elders sometimes to gather and guide and that kind of stuff. So it's a split up. These denominations are, if they have the same type of attendance that we have at our services, they have, let's say 100 people, but they only have one church doing one service having 100 people. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So what we get confused in is we look at each individual parish as their own church, when really the Catholic Church as a whole, we're serving in North Bay area, let's say 2,000 people on a weekend.
Right.
Whereas if we're comparing that to another denomination, smog area, let's say, just so not to offend anybody, but they have 100 people sitting in their pews. If they look at 100 people or 200 people sitting in their pews versus 200 people sitting in the Catholic pews, their one service looks very comparable.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But we have 6, 8, was that 12 of those, or however many, 9 of those at least services going on. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think there's numbers there as well that we don't think about.
But then again, so your point about paper Catholics or whatever
100%.
it might be, but here we are with these stats thrown at us, right, by Stats Canada. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I'm not surprised by the fact that the numbers are declining.
No, of course
right?
Not. Yeah.
But I think there's a couple things that it should bring to our attention. Number one, like all of us, our goal, our purpose, our mission from Jesus is to go and make disciples. Mm-hmm. Like go and make disciples. And when the numbers over the last 20 years are declining, and sort of the culture in Canada is increasingly anti-religion or not, I shouldn't say anti. I don't want to sound like, oh, we're so persecuted. In some ways, I guess we are.
Yeah.
But in other, I don't want to sound like a sore loser or whatever like that. The culture is just growing less sympathetic to religion or a religious thought.
Yeah.
How about religious practice or whatever?
Yeah, and from like a data analytics or like kind of population perspective, that you have a critical mass factor.
Yeah.
That 20 years ago, if the numbers were over 50%, if it becomes increasingly like, then you have mob mentality, or then you have kind of, it's cool to be Christian because the majority is. As soon as you drop below that 50% threshold, you're no longer in a majority position. So the perception is that, no, this is no longer desirable. This is no longer. I'm not part of the crowd.
Right.
So you'll witness a steep decline after that, just demographically. And this, we have this across Canada now, but we witnessed this particularly in Quebec in the last, like, as kind of a prefiguration of this kind of trend that, you know, once cultural Catholicism fell off to a certain degree in Quebec, like just in terms of numbers, there was a steep decline. After that point, because that's just how, you know, demographics work over time. But I would be interested to see if that same decline, you know, was represented in the pews at the same proportion, because, you know, you do witness a small decline, and I haven't followed this as closely in the last 20 years because I've only been part of the church for the last 10 years. But again, that significant percentage. I wonder if that's just a drop off of the cultural Catholics, the paper Catholics, the ones who would self-identify on, you know, a census in 2001, whether or not they were regularly attending Mass.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about that. Like, what would be the real numbers? You know, like, so Josh says people are just checking the box and saying I'm Catholic, even though I don't practice. Yeah. You know, maybe the real numbers are
lower,
significantly lower. I don't know.
Are.
Yeah, they might be, right? But now, get this, right? So when you said when we sort of reached below the 50% mark, right? You know, then we're sort of no longer
in a minority position.
We're in a minority position now, right? But I think even though we might have 53% or 63% in 10 years ago, 70% 20 years ago, the cultural idea in Canada, in North America perhaps, has seeped into the psyche of Catholics and Christians, right? And has made us less motivated or full of zeal to live out our faith. So even when we had, let's say, the majority, right? Like, it didn't matter. In your workplace, people would be quiet rather than stand up for their faith. Yeah. In the political sphere, people would be quiet or, as we see, specifically vote against their faith conscience, right? Just to pass their things. So this culture we live in is so opposed to what we're called as Christians to do that people have bought it. Like, people have bought into it. And almost people have given up. Like, people are like, well, what's the use in fighting it anymore? Yeah. Right? Yeah. And I think that even reaches people in the pews. Because I see it, and I'm not pointing fingers like, but it's in the hearts of people. We want to love Jesus. We want to live as disciples of Jesus, but it's just so hard out there that we're not going to.
So you see, okay, I was at a conference, at a retreat over the weekend, and the speaker was speaking about someone else's idea. And if I get this, so it was Brian. That was speaking. I think it was Bishop Scott McCraig, McCaig, not McCraig. Sorry, McCaig. I think it was him speaking about that. If I get that mixed up, don't penalize me on that. But there was the idea was from a couple of different sources. But this is what they talked about in the age of Christendom. Faith used to inform reason, then reason shaped your will, right, and then your will controlled your behavior. What happened in the age of technology and the age of science, as that grew in the last 100 years or 200 years, was that now faith kind of started to take a back door to reason. We need to prove things without a shadow of a doubt. Well, faith doesn't work that way. Faith is, you need to have faith. You can't prove without a shadow of doubt this, that, or the other thing necessarily. So reason started to creep in and take over as technology, as information, as things became. You had to be able to prove your theory, and if you could prove it, then you were believed. So then what happened is faith took a back door. So we began. Science started to kind of take over that dominant position. So reason strictly became about what you can prove, and so reason then informed will, which then shaped behavior. So everything became about what you can prove and how you prove it and everything else. But what happened is, and I've given a talk on this, and I think we've talked about it before, science and faith don't contradict each other. They can't contradict each other. And because they go hand in hand. There's no way to get to faith except through science, right? And so because of that, what we started to see then is it became less about science, because science has to hang on to faith. Like they go hand in hand. And so because of that, reason then started not becoming a thing. For instance, at one time before reason was a thing, we started like the abortion clause, for instance. The abortion could happen because we didn't have the science to prove that this was a baby. Right? Does that make sense? So we could abort this fetus. We're not even going to call it a baby. We can abort this because we don't have the science to prove that this is a baby. So abortion now is okay. Then 30 years later, we can now prove that this is a human baby with a different DNA from the moment of conception, which is what the Catholic Church was teaching from all along. So science now backs up the church's teaching, or backs up faith. So now the only course of action is either to go back to faith or to keep going down this road and now ignore science. So now we stop ignoring. Now we started to ignore reason and science, and now will is in control, and will and what you want and what you feel. So now it's not about whether this is a baby or not. This is about, well, what does the mother feel? How does the mother, what does the mother want? What does the mother feel? It doesn't matter. The other person doesn't come into it.
This has implications not just for faith and for religious connotation.
100%.
It's having implications everywhere, even in the, like, Matt, you're the smartest one here on the panel. but like, even in the world of academia, for example.
100%.
Right? Like, you both are professors, so like that, like, sort of thought or feel or whatever has taken over some legitimate intellectual study. Yeah. Right. And it's not just taken over like faith or academia. It's taken over just society. It's like now that's what matters most.
Yeah.
That's what matters most. It's what I feel.
It's exactly.
Or whatever it is.
And you can't prove that. So for instance, I mean, and not to get into the, we've talked about different problems before, but if we talk about the trans movement coming through and stuff, let's not focus on that. But let's just say, to use a similar idea, I decide that I feel like I'm 60 or 65. Do I get a senior discount? How do you prove otherwise? Because this is all about how I feel now. This is about what I prefer, what I feel. This is not about science. Right. This is not about looking at my license and saying I'm 40. Like, this is not anything. This is about how I feel. Can you deny me this senior's discount if I feel this way?
Yeah, it's definitely dangerous territory for that mentality to continue in our culture, right? And I like what you were saying, because the stats sort of back that up a little bit, because only 19% of Canadians 65 and older said they had no religious affiliation. Yeah. 19%. Whereas those between the ages of 15 and 64 was 36.5%, so almost double.
Yeah.
And those 14 and younger, 42.5%.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
But I mean, like, have you talked to a 14-year-old? Like, they're not like, they're like talking to you, and like one eye is on their phone and one eye. I mean, sure, I'm generalizing, but like, I think we have a serious issue. I think we have a serious problem in society, but I'm trying to focus a little bit on like us as Catholics. Yes. Like, there's so many people out there that aren't hearing the gospel message.
Yeah.
Right? They're not hearing the gospel message.
How do you push the gospel message, though, if you can't use reason and you can't use faith to push it? That's so now we have to look at experiences, and maybe this is where we talked about another podcast where you have experiences when you go on pilgrimages and all that type of stuff. Maybe this is where the church is headed into, like, you look at Peter and Paul and the Acts of the Apostles and stuff, and how they perform these awesome miracles. Maybe this is the time that the church is headed into these awesome miracles, because it's the only thing that's going to make your head spin on its heel, because it's not about what you feel anymore. It's about, what's going on here? Because you got to get out of that. How do we change? At one time, you could reason somebody, you could show them the reason of why the church has taught what they taught for 2,000 years. Now you can't do that because it's will. I don't feel this way. It goes against my feelings.
Yeah, and it comes down to kind of what you propose as the solution to this problem.
Yeah.
So like for years, the trend that people wanted to identify was that people go to college and they lose their faith, or they start studying this or that. They go into a humanities department and they lose their faith. And my experience was the exact opposite. I really latched on to Catholicism and exploring my faith when I was studying philosophy. When I was what's his name? Archbishop Charles Chaput He gave a lecture a few years ago, which became the basis for his book, Strangers in a Strange Land. And he uses the decline of cultural Catholicism in Quebec as a case study that he says, let's try and pinpoint this problem, because a lot of people will lay that at the floor. Like our young people aren't properly catechized. They don't understand the faith well enough that, when they go into another environment, they don't have the tools to kind of defend their position against these pseudo-academics who are, again, more interested in will and ideology than a lot of times kind of reason and proper academics. But he's saying that, look at Quebec, this at a cultural level, their catechesis was pretty good, and they still experienced this fall off. They still experienced this decline. Mm-hmm. And he's saying that catechesis isn't enough. It's important, but it's not enough. So coming back to what Father was saying, or that they weren't necessarily properly evangelized. That it's, if people are properly evangelized, if people actually have a relationship with Jesus Christ, if people's if it's more than kind of checking a box on a census form, that if this is more than a cultural identity, if this is, forms a part of who you are and what you informs your actions in your day-to-day life. Again, maybe this census gives an indication of, what the numbers were all along. In kind of a real practical sense. But again, if we are looking for, what's the solution to this problem? Yes, giving accurate information about the faith is important, but, introducing or inviting people to have a direct encounter with Jesus Christ, that's how we...
And you can't invite people to have a direct... I can't invite people to know Matt unless I know Matt well.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it does kind of come down to we have to put the footsteps in place so that we understand and have that relationship so that we can introduce people to God. So we got to be doing our daily prayer. We got to be going to Mass, receiving the Eucharist, being fed in our faith. Mm-hmm. And then we can kind of, and then look for the opportunities. Take their faith inward so that we can push it outward, so that we can look at how to be true disciples and how to actually go out and evangelize.
The article we were talking about from CBC, which was talking about the decline in religious affiliation, also says, there's a sort of a sub-headline that says that people come together around, quote, things that matter to them, right? And it talks about how there's sort of a rise in community activities, in-person activities, right? Or online forums like book clubs, knitting clubs, sports teams, sort of secular groups, online chat groups.
Especially after COVID.
Right.
Imagine that.
You know what I mean? And so things that matter are listed like that. So what, you're talking about relationship with Jesus, right? If someone's outside of a relationship with Jesus, then really he doesn't matter, right? He might people might have respect and love for Jesus, but because there's not this relationship there, it just doesn't matter enough to be part of Jesus' community, right? Of Jesus' family. So let's with those statistics that I mentioned about the seniors and the young people, whatever it might be. What does that look like? You have I talk to so many grandparents who are just so heartbroken that their grandkids aren't practicing their faith, right? What does this look like? You guys suggested this, in this invitation, whatever, so grandparents and their children and their grandchildren. There's almost like this. People just sort of freeze when it comes to having to talk about their faith with someone they love, right? Mm-hmm. And they just watch as they just stand by so sad as people sort of fall away from the faith, right? Yeah. What can be done in this, because there's from this census a generational gap. I mean, not just from the census, we can see it ourselves, right? We don't have to read the census to know that.
Yeah. We have a real thing called intercessory prayer.
Yeah.
Your very first thing, whenever you're trying to get over a hurdle that seems insurmountable, bring it to Jesus. Bring your prayer and start praying for it every day. And then what you're going to see, and then you're waiting as you're praying for it every single day, you're going to start to see where that opportunity is. God's going to give you the door. He's not, you're going to be asking for something. You're asking for bread. He's not going to give you, a stone. He's going to give you the opportunity because he wants that person back too, and so you got to start with prayer. You got to start for interceding with
I do think that, grandparents are really great prayers.
I do think so too.
I think God hears the prayers of grandparents first, because it's just so honest and heartfelt. What do you think?
I was just going to say, that I hate to publicly agree with the CBC, but I do want to question, like how much this matter. Like going back to the 2001 census, of the people who self-identified as Catholic, how many of them were fully engaged and invested in the sacramental life. So like, again, if we want this to matter to others, if we want to invite others to participate in the sacramental life, we need to be living that and embodying that, and communicating that to our children and our friends, and the people who encounter us should encounter Christ at some level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really good. Yeah, I think too. Like if you're living out your faith and you're living out your relationship with Jesus. I mean, everybody knows that I'm married. Everyone knows I have 4 boys. Why? Because I scream it at every opportunity. You know what I mean? It's not something I'm ever shy about. It's not something I'm ever, but it's not something I also go exaggerating about necessarily. Like it's just a reality of my life. I have my 4 boys, and I love having my 4 boys. They're awesome. My wife as well. She's amazing. You know what I mean? Like that. Those relationships just happen, and they come out in my conversation. Mm-hmm. But so does my faith a lot of times. Yeah. If I'm living my faith, I have no problem saying, like last night I was leaving the church and this happened. You know what I mean?
Right.
I was leaving a group of friends of mine that, like that's not, I'm saying I'm leaving the church. It just comes out. It's natural if you're not embarrassed and you're not, trying to hide it.
Now, we've talked about some sort of depressing numbers and situations, but what you just said sort of leads me to think of hopeful situations, because like there's
some real hope,
of course, and I truly believe that, and I when we follow the Lord, there's always hope. But I really find really beautiful. I'm edified very often when I see people or hear people talk about their faith in public.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I see even young people who would normally be sort of made fun of or
in a high school setting.
And when they step up and are talking to their peers, and not in a weird way. There's always like weird, but like just confidently like expressing their love for God, praying for people, getting involved in sort of the
not being shy about their faith or their relationship with God.
It's beautiful. And I really see that the key there is when they've encountered Jesus, when they know this relationship with the Lord, and then it doesn't matter. It's like, oh, what? So that kid's going to make fun of me or whatever like that. It doesn't matter anymore, right? Because they've had this encounter. And I think ultimately when we work with young people, but also when we work with families, like that's what we're leading them to. We're leading them to an encounter with Jesus Christ. And I think grandparents and parents, have to just sort of reclaim the courage from their relationship with Jesus to go and have these honest conversations with their family and friends. Like, because a lot of people say, well, I've already suggested the issue and, they told me to be quiet or drop it or whatever. And then it's like, I can never bring it up again.
And realize dragging them to church service might not be your answer at the beginning, right? Like it might be having conversation. It might be, can you do me a favor? I want to talk with you once a week, and I want you to discuss with me the Bible readings.
Yeah.
This thing. And if you just start that just do it for me. You're not now dragging them into a public setting.
That's right.
Where they are going to feel uncomfortable because they don't know the words, they don't know how to do things, they don't know how to say things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like and it's not an experience. If you're not understanding what's going on in the Mass, it is boring. 100%. It's the same thing over and over again. That's not the definition of great entertainment.
That's right.
It's not supposed to be entertaining. It's supposed to be feeding.
Sure, and even sharing little things, like, I heard the homily at church and they challenged us to do this, or I know grandparents who send little emails to their grandkids, little quotes that they get from the saints or whatever it is, But prayer is key, obviously. But I honestly think Pope Benedict said, it's going to happen where we're going to become sort of a smaller church, but we're going to become a smaller church full of, I think like really strong disciples of Jesus. And so I wouldn't say that, of course it saddens me to see the stats because I want everyone to love Jesus and I want everyone to be disciples of Jesus, right? I think that's all of our prayer. But I don't think it's an occasion for us to lose hope. I think, with 10.9 million Catholics in Canada, like let's call upon our brothers and sisters. Let's pray for our brothers and sisters. Yeah. Let's pray for our nation. Let's pray for our country.
Right now, if I understand the numbers correctly, we're 30% versus the 30% of the nuns, if you
Yeah.
will. Those are the highest denominations or religious
Catholics and non-religious. Yeah.
What that means to me is if you don't know apologetics, you don't need it, because all you got to do is get people to have that relationship. Like you have the two biggest populations, one has no affiliation whatsoever,
Right.
and the other has, if you know your faith, has the truth. And so it's very easy.
And the backing of the Holy Spirit.
And the backing of the Holy Spirit. Like,
which we can't
go
forget
do
about.
your call. Go
Yeah.
be disciples. You got a wider audience than you've ever had before in Canada. Like you can live out your call more than anybody else.
Yeah, and if we're looking for kind of a hopeful angle there, that with the the rise of the nuns, NONE, that you're not having to overcome a lot of people's preconceptions or misconceptions.
Yeah, because
about
they don't
Christianity,
actually know anything. Yeah,
you're actually starting from scratch. So you have an opportunity there to inform people's perception of faith and God.
All right. Well, our time has come to an end here. So thank you very much for this discussion. And if anyone has questions about anything we talked about today, or comments to make, or suggestions for a future episode, you can email us at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. Visit our website at thecatholicbuzz.com, or leave a comment, like, or share our stuff on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And you know what? Tell your friends and family about our podcast. There's lots of topics we've talked about that could help them in their growing in their faith as well. All right, for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milgen, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.